You know, we usually think of a school building as like a greenhouse.
Right.
You put the seedlings in, you give them all the same water, the same sunlight, the same soil, and you just watch them grow. It feels like a very natural, entirely neutral process.
It's an incredibly comforting image, isn't it? We look at a classroom and we just see a standardized environment.
Yeah.
The textbook is uniform, the desks are all arranged the same way, the bell rings at the same time for everyone. So the assumption is that whatever differences emerge in those students, well, they're purely the result of their own natural abilities.
But today, we're taking a sledgehammer to that greenhouse.
We really are.
We're breaking down decades of sociological and philosophical research to show you the invisible wiring behind those classroom walls. Welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Our mission today is to connect some very abstract theories about how human beings even define truth to the very real everyday ways that schools sort us, how they shape our identities, and essentially reproduce the social classes we were born into.
Yeah, the real on-the-ground stuff.
Exactly. So whether you are a parent trying to navigate this massive machine for your kids, or maybe a student currently sitting in it, or just a curious learner trying to understand why society functions the way it does, we are going to expose the hidden architecture of education.
And to really see that architecture, we actually have to start high up in the clouds. We have to look at how society decides what even counts as true.
Okay, where do we start with that?
Well, you have to go back to the Enlightenment, specifically the empiricists. Thinkers like John Locke and David Hume. They established this idea that the mind is a blank slate.
A tabula rasa.
Exactly, a tabula rasa. They argued that all genuine knowledge comes purely from sensory experience. You observe the physical world, you gather data, and from that data you build objective knowledge.
So seeing is believing. You measure the world, and that measurement becomes an indisputable fact.
That was the foundation, yeah. And then in the 19th century, a philosopher named Auguste Comte took that foundation and built a framework he called positivism.
Positivism. Okay.
Right. Comte believed that human society could be studied and measured with the exact same rigor as, like, chemistry or physics.
Wow.
Yeah. Positivism basically argued that if you observe humans closely enough and gather enough data, you can uncover these immutable mathematical laws of human behavior.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I can see how that translates directly into modern schooling.
Oh, absolutely.
Under positivism, if you just design the perfectly calibrated multiple choice test, or, the ultimate psychometric evaluation, you can measure a student's intelligence perfectly.
Right.
It's almost like treating society as a predictable game of billiards.
Yeah.
You hit a ball at a certain angle with a certain force, and it always yields the exact same trajectory.
That billiard analogy captures the mechanical optimism of positivism perfectly. But by the 1920s and 30s, a group of thinkers from the Frankfurt School, specifically theorists like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, they argued that the billiard game was fundamentally rigged. They developed what is known as critical theory.
And just a quick note here, just to be clear for you listening, we are exploring these ideas purely as academic frameworks to understand the sociology of education, right? We're not endorsing a specific political worldview here.
Of course. Strictly looking at the academic theory. But critical theory argued that positivism was actually quite dangerous.
Dangerous in what way? I mean, how is the standardized test dangerous?
Because the Frankfurt School believed that treating human beings like predictable data points strips them of their humanity. They called this instrumental rationality.
Instrumental rationality.
Yeah. When you obsess over efficiency and measurement, you kind of turn people into mindless cogs in a larger machine. And furthermore, they argued that facts are never completely neutral.
Right, because someone has to write the test.
Exactly. A test doesn't just measure objective reality. It measures a reality that has been shaped by human values, biases, and, historical power structures.
So the billiard balls have their own desires, their own cultural backgrounds.
Yes.
And the table they're playing on is deeply tilted.
That's it. So when a school presents a curriculum as objective, undisputed fact, a critical theorist steps in and asks, well, hold on, whose facts are these?
Right. Who decided this specific information was valuable?
And who benefits from teaching reality this way? That is the core of the critique. And it connects directly to a concept introduced by the neo-Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci. He called it hegemony.
Hegemony, right.
Gramsci observed how ruling groups maintain their dominance over society. Historically, we think of power as physical force, right? Armies, police.
Sure.
But Gramsci realized that the most effective way to maintain power is to get the subordinate classes to actually consent to their own domination.
And how do you do that? I mean, you can't just ask people to accept being at the bottom of the ladder.
No, you do it by making the current system feel like natural common sense.
Ugh.
Hegemony is like the invisible cultural water we swim in.
Ugh.
It convinces us that the artificial rules of society are just the natural laws of the universe.
Wow. So, to bring this back to the classroom, if a student takes a standardized test and gets a terrible grade, hegemony is the force that makes that student say, well, I guess I'm just not naturally smart.
Yes, exactly.
Rather than saying, this test was designed by a dominant culture that prioritizes a highly specific, very narrow type of cognitive skill.
Right. The student internalizes the structural failure as a personal defect.
That's wild. They internalize it.
That internalization is the ultimate victory of hegemony. The student willingly accepts their lower position in society because the sorting mechanism, the test, was presented to them as this objective positivist tool.
Okay, so if hegemony convinces us the game is fair, who actually writes the rules of that game? I mean, who decides what gets put on that standardized test or written into that curriculum in the first place?
That is the pivotal question that researchers like Michael Young and Jean Ennion sought to answer. They looked at what is deemed official knowledge inside schools.
Official knowledge.
Right. Ennion conducted this extensive observational research across different socioeconomic demographics and found something astonishing. The actual definition of knowledge, like what it means to learn, it changes entirely depending on the social class of the students in the building.
I really want to dig into how that actually manifests, because we just assume a biology class is a biology class regardless of the zip code.
You would think so. But Ennion's research found a stark divide. In predominantly working-class schools, official knowledge is presented as rote memorization and procedural compliance.
Wow.
The unspoken curriculum is about following steps without questioning them. It's essentially training for mechanical labor.
Memorize this formula, fill out this worksheet, don't ask why.
Exactly. But as you move up the socioeconomic ladder into elite, affluent schools, the definition of knowledge transforms.
Sure.
It stops being about memorizing disconnected facts and becomes about critical thinking.
Problem solving.
Problem solving, challenging the status quo. Students are asked to analyze, to synthesize, to express their own independent opinions.
It's literally a different curriculum preparing kids for a completely different destiny.
It really is.
And the sociological research dives really deep into these elite environments. I mean, institutions like the historic UK public schools, which are actually private boarding schools, the French Grande École, and the ultra-wealthy American prep schools.
Yes.
Sociologists describe them as total institutions.
Total institutions.
Yeah.
That term means these schools control almost every waking moment of a student's life.
Right.
They utilize physical closure, often isolating students on these sprawling remote campuses far from the general public. They implement intricate, highly exclusive rites of passage.
Like secret societies almost.
Kind of, yeah. And they use incredibly specific curricula to socialize these students.
And what's fascinating to me is how that curriculum differs by country, yet achieves the exact same goal.
Yeah.
Like in the UK, those elite boarding schools have historically placed a massive emphasis on team sports like rugby or cricket.
Right. And why is that?
Well, because it wasn't about the sport. It was about building a specific type of stoic character and forging these lifelong, gentlemanly networks.
Exactly. While in France, the Grandes Écoles take a totally different approach. They emphasize intense, highly competitive mathematics. Math. Because math is seen as the ultimate infallible filter. It appears purely objective, so it legitimizes the elite sorting process.
I see.
If you survive the brutal math examinations, society accepts that you naturally deserve to be part of the ruling class.
That makes total sense. The research refers to this as the charter of elite schools. They aren't just distributing high-status facts. They possess a societal mandate, a charter, to produce a specific type of adult leader.
Right.
They are socializing a class of people to feel entirely comfortable wielding power, instilling this profound, unquestioned sense of entitlement to leadership.
And that charter is highly adaptable. It shifts based on what the state or the private economy needs at any given historical moment.
So whether that's colonial administrators in the 19th century or tech CEOs today.
Exactly. The constants are the exclusivity and the socialization of power.
Okay, but here's my question. If elite schools are basically monopolies on high-status knowledge, how do the rest of the public schools manage this sorting process? Because, the vast majority of kids aren't going to a French Grande École or an American prep school, they are in the everyday public system.
Well, the primary mechanism for distributing knowledge within the public school system is known as tracking, or streaming, or setting, depending on where you live.
Right.
This is the practice of separating students into different classrooms based on their purported cognitive abilities or prior academic achievements.
Now, the original stated intent of tracking was efficiency, right? The positivist logic was that if you group students by ability, teachers can target their instruction more effectively.
That's the idea, yeah.
A teacher doesn't have to struggle to reach the advanced kids and the struggling kids in the exact same hour.
Right, that was the administrative justification. But decades of sociological data reveal a very different reality. Tracking reliably exacerbates inequality without boosting overall academic productivity.
Wow.
Yeah. The high-track students continually widen their advantage, while the low-track students just fall further and further behind.
And the research explains how this happens, which really exposes the flaw in the system. It's not just that the kids in the lower tracks happen to learn at a slower pace. It's an actual instructional gap.
Yes.
The actual teaching changes.
Exactly. If you look at Arthur Appleby's research on English classes, the contrast is just glaring. High-track students are given discussion-based, challenging literature. They are asked authentic, open-ended questions where there is no pre-specified answer.
The teacher acts as a facilitator for their intellectual exploration.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the low-track students are handed fragmented, slow-paced worksheets. The instruction focuses heavily on behavior management and basic decoding skills rather than critical thought.
And they also systematically receive less experienced teachers and fewer resources, right?
Yes, that too. And the demographics of who ends up in which track are deeply alarming. Minority students and English language learners are disproportionately funneled into these lower, dead-end tracks.
Even when their test scores match.
Even when their standardized test scores match their white native English-speaking peers, the sorting machine frequently conflates a lack of English fluency or a different cultural background with a lack of innate cognitive ability.
It essentially traps these students in a modified curriculum where they are never given the opportunity to access the advanced material that colleges and high-paying careers actually demand.
Exactly.
But, I want to push back on this just a little, because framing tracking as a universal evil ignores some interesting nuance in the sources. Is tracking always a disaster, or is it just poorly executed in most public schools?
That is a really vital distinction to make. The research does highlight some notable exceptions. Take the study by Carol Burris in New York where detracking actually worked.
Okay, how do they do it?
The district eliminated their low-track math classes entirely and placed everyone into an accelerated curriculum.
But wait, they didn't just throw the struggling kids into the deep end and hope they could swim, right?
No, exactly the opposite. The key to their success was that they combined the accelerated curriculum with intensive supplemental workshop support. They provided the institutional scaffolding. Extra time, dedicated resources, targeted help for the low-achieving students to catch up.
And it worked.
It did. The result was that achievement rose significantly for the lower percentiles without hindering the high achievers at all.
That's amazing. And there was another fascinating exception highlighted in the research: Catholic schools.
Right?
Sociologists found that Catholic schools frequently mitigate the harms of tracking by maintaining rigorous academic standards even in their lowest tracks.
Yes, they ensure that every track leads to a meaningful credential.
So it's not that grouping kids by ability is inherently destructive. It's that large public systems often use lower tracks as a warehousing operation to keep kids quiet, rather than an actual educational pipeline.
Exactly. If a lower track fundamentally leads nowhere, the students recognize that immediately and act accordingly.
Of course.
But if it leads to a respected outcome, well, the culture of the classroom changes completely.
So if the schools are actively sorting kids, what happens when a parent realizes their kid is being sorted into the bottom tier? I mean, they don't just sit back and watch.
Definitely not.
This brings us to how the tracking system is manipulated by the external pressures of the home.
This is where we look at the groundbreaking observational research by sociologist Annette Leroux. She spent years embedding with families across different classes to understand how parenting styles interact with institutional power.
And what did she find?
She found that middle-class parents generally employ a strategy she calls concerted cultivation.
Concerted cultivation. This is such a fascinating concept. Under this, parents basically view their children as projects to be meticulously developed.
Yes, they fill their kids' schedules with structured activities. But more importantly, they actively teach their children how to interact with adults and institutions.
They teach them to look teachers in the eye, to ask questions.
To negotiate for accommodations, to advocate for themselves.
So it's less like being a generic sports agent lobbying for playing time and more like, I don't know, training a junior partner at a law firm.
I love that analogy, yes.
You're transferring crucial cultural capital. You're teaching the kid the secret handshakes of the professional world.
Exactly.
How to challenge authority politely, how to ask for an extension on a paper, how to demand a spot in the gifted program.
That captures the cultural capital aspect perfectly. Leroux notes that these middle-class kids develop what she calls a robust sense of entitlement.
Entitlement, wow.
Yeah, they expect institutions to accommodate them. Working-class parents, on the other hand, operate under a framework Leroux calls the accomplishment of natural growth.
And we should clarify, this isn't a critique of their love or care.
Not at all. These parents provide deep affection, food, and clear, non-negotiable boundaries.
Right.
But they view child development as something that unfolds naturally, without the need for relentless adult intervention. Crucially, they tend to defer to the authority of educators.
They trust the school to do its job.
Yes, rather than treating the school as an adversary to be managed and negotiated with.
The tragedy here is that the modern school system fundamentally rewards the concerted cultivation approach and penalizes the natural growth approach.
It really does.
Like a teacher sees a middle-class kid negotiating a grade and thinks, wow, what a bright, engaged student.
Right.
They see a working-class kid quietly accepting a bad grade out of respect for authority, and they just assume the kid doesn't care.
And researchers like Ellen Brantlinger and Diane Ray take this dynamic even further. They studied how middle-class parents actively work to ensure their children remain the winners in this system.
Because tracking is a zero-sum game.
Exactly. One child's admission into the limited gifted program means another child is excluded. So these parents often face a moral dilemma.
How do they rationalize securing advantages that hurt other people's kids?
Well, they neutralize their own guilt by viewing the students who fail the system as intellectually or culturally deficient.
Oh, wow.
They rely on that hegemonic idea again. My child worked hard and is naturally gifted. Those other children simply lack the drive.
It completely erases the massive systemic advantages and the aggressive parental lobbying that actually secured their child's placement.
Exactly. And the ultimate physical expression of this parental maneuvering is what researchers call the geography of schooling.
Spatial protection.
Yes. Middle-class families literally buy boundaries. They purchase expensive homes in exclusive school districts or pay exorbitant private school tuition.
To physically insulate their children from the working class.
Precisely. This leaves working-class students stranded in increasingly segregated, critically under-resourced public schools. So the sorting machine isn't just an abstract concept.
No.
It operates through real estate and physical geography.
That's incredible. But, what about the kids caught in the middle of this? We've looked at the philosophers designing the machine, the administrators running it, the parents manipulating it. But how do the students themselves internalize this massive invisible sorting system?
This is where the research gets deeply personal. Diane Ree refers to this as the psychosocial dimension of class.
Psychosocial dimension.
Yeah. In the classroom environment, middle-class students essentially monopolize the concept of being bright. Academic success becomes a core pillar of their identity.
Right.
But working-class students often live in a psychic economy defined by chronic fear and anxiety.
Fear of what?
Well, in one of the qualitative interviews, a student explicitly expressed a profound terror of becoming a nothing.
A nothing. Wow. To be sitting in a classroom at 14 years old, terrified that society is molding you into a nothing, that is absolutely haunting.
It is.
But they don't always just sit there and quietly accept that fate, do they?
No, they don't. The research documents extensive student resistance, most famously in Paul Willis's classic 1970s study, Learning to Labor.
Right, the lads.
Yes. He embedded with a group of working-class boys in the UK, whom he called the lads. And Willis's work is foundational because it shows how resistance actually fuels the sorting machine.
How so?
The lads aggressively rejected the school's culture. They viewed the compliant, academically successful students whom they mocked as the ear-rolls as effeminate and subservient.
Because to the lads, real masculinity, real authenticity was found on the factory floor.
Exactly.
So they rebelled, they disrupted class, they refused to do the work, and they constructed this vibrant counterculture that mocked the teacher's authority.
They thought they were piercing the illusion of the school. They thought they were beating the system. But Willis points out the tragic irony.
What's the irony?
By refusing to acquire academic credentials, they were perfectly preparing themselves for the manual labor jobs that the capitalist system needed them to fill.
Oh, man.
They actively participated in the reproduction of their own subordinate social class.
They locked themselves into the exact box the system had prepared for them.
Yes, they did.
But there's an even darker twist to this when you bring it into the modern day, because in the 1970s, when Willis wrote that study, resisting school led you to a stable, unionized factory job.
Right, you could buy a house, raise a family.
Exactly. You could have a secure life.
Yeah.
What happens when that economy disappears?
That is exactly what sociologist Lois Weiss investigated. In her 15-year follow-up study called Class Reunion, she tracked similar working-class students who utilized that same anti-school resistance, but in a post-industrial globalized economy.
And the results?
They were devastating.
Because there's no factory floor waiting to catch them anymore.
The safety net has been completely removed. Weiss found that in today's economy, that traditional working-class rebellion leads directly into marginal, temporary employment or even housing insecurity.
Wow.
Furthermore, researchers Nolan and Enian emphasize that for marginalized youth of color, this exact same oppositional behavior in school often triggers disciplinary action, action that funnels them straight into the criminal justice system.
So the rebellion remains, but the economic reward for it has totally vanished.
Exactly.
The students are still actively participating in their own marginalization, but the consequences are now catastrophic.
Which brings us full circle back to the philosophers.
Right.
We started with the positivists, who genuinely believed they could find a clean, objective, mathematical formula for human behavior and education. But when you look at the stark realities of tracking, concerted cultivation, and student resistance, you see that the critical theorists were observing the actual mechanics of society.
Knowledge is never neutral.
Never. It is always intimately tied to power, culture, and social reproduction.
Schools, parents, and the students themselves interact in this incredibly complex, often invisible web that reproduces social class generation after generation.
Yeah.
And for you listening, whether you are trying to advocate for your own child in this system, or you are simply trying to make sense of the vast inequalities you see in your community, you can now see the matrix.
You really can.
You can see the hegemonic ideologies, the instructional gaps in tracking, and the cultural capital that shape what we call education.
Because understanding the true nature of the system is the absolute prerequisite to challenging it, you know?
Right.
You cannot fix a complex, biased sorting machine if you still genuinely believe you were just tending to a natural greenhouse.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought inspired by these researchers. We didn't explicitly dive into Thomas Kuhn's concept of paradigm shifts today, but it really runs beneath all of this.
Oh, for sure.
Kuhn argued that scientific understanding doesn't evolve smoothly or gradually. It shifts violently when the old model breaks down completely and can no longer explain reality.
Right.
Our current educational system was clearly built on an industrial-era paradigm. It was designed to track, sort, and reproduce a class structure suited for factories and mid-level management. But the post-industrial economy has broken that model. The old destinations are gone.
Completely gone.
So if the industrial paradigm of education is currently collapsing under its own weight, what will the inevitable violent educational paradigm shift look like in the next 20 years? And more importantly, who will be left behind when the Earth moves? We send kids into these buildings assuming they're all getting the same map. But maybe it's time we ask why we are still using maps for a world that no longer exists.